My name is Serafina Thornfield, and for 26 years, I believed my story was simple. Abandoned baby, loving grandfather, quiet life in a small Vermont town. I had no idea that walking into Judge Lysander Blackthorn's courtroom would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and the inheritance that had suddenly made me the target of people I'd never met, but who claimed to be my parents. It started 3 months ago with a phone call that changed everything. I was in my grandfather's study, now mine, cataloging his extensive collection of first edition novels when my attorney, Marcus Pemberton, called with news that made my blood run cold. "Serafina, we have a problem," Marcus said, his usually calm voice tight with concern. "I've just received legal documents. Your biological parents, Cordova and Damien Ashworth, are contesting your grandfather's will. They're claiming that as your natural parents, they have rightful claim to Matthias's entire estate." I sank into grandfather's leather chair, the same one where he'd read me bedtime stories and taught me chess, where we'd spent countless evenings discussing literature and life. The irony wasn't lost on me that these people, whoever they were, had chosen this moment to suddenly remember my existence. "Marcus, they abandoned me when I was 2 months old," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Grandfather has been my guardian, my father, my everything since then. They have no right to anything. Legally, it's more complicated than that," Marcus admitted. "They never formally relinquished their parental rights. Your grandfather gained custody through what appears to have been an informal arrangement. They're arguing that the will should be invalidated because they weren't properly notified of his death or given opportunity to contest it." The absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Matthias Thornfield had died 6 months ago at the age of 87, leaving me his sprawling Victorian home, his successful antique book business, and investments worth nearly $2 million. He'd spent 26 years raising me, loving me, preparing me to carry on his legacy. And now, these strangers wanted to sweep in and claim it all. "What do we know about them?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Marcus cleared his throat. "Cordova Ashworth, née Meridian, currently lives in Boston. She's a real estate developer, quite successful by all accounts. Damien Ashworth is her husband of 28 years, works in finance. They have 2 other children, twins born 10 years after you." The words hit me harder than I expected. They had other children. They'd built a family, a life, without me. Whatever had driven them to abandon me clearly hadn't prevented them from becoming parents again. "Serafina, there's something else," Marcus continued, his tone growing more serious. "They're claiming that your grandfather essentially kidnapped you, that they were young and struggling, and he offered to help temporarily, then refused to return you and manipulated the legal system to maintain custody." I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and fierce. Matthias Thornfield had been the most honorable man I'd ever known, a retired literature professor who'd opened his antique bookshop after my grandmother died. He'd dedicated his life to preserving knowledge and nurturing my love of learning. The idea that he would manipulate or deceive anyone was not just wrong, it was offensive. "That's a lie," I said firmly. "Grandfather never lied to me about anything. He told me they couldn't care for me, that they asked him to take me in. Unfortunately, without documentation, it becomes a matter of he said, she said, and Matthias isn't here to defend himself." The legal proceedings began immediately. I found myself thrust into a world of depositions, document reviews, and character assassinations that felt surreal. Cordova and Damien Ashworth painted themselves as young parents who'd made a mistake, who'd trusted Matthias to help temporarily, and then been systematically cut out of their child's life. They produced witnesses who testified to their character, their stable marriage, their success as parents to their twins. Their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Castellane, was ruthless in her portrayal of my grandfather as a manipulative old man who'd stolen their child and poisoned me against them. She made it sound as though I was a victim of elaborate brainwashing, too damaged by years of lies to see the truth about my loving parents who'd never stopped thinking about me. The worst part was that I began to doubt myself. Late at night, in the house that had always been my sanctuary, I found myself questioning memories I'd held sacred. Had grandfather really been protecting me? Or had there been more to the story? The Ashworths seemed so normal, so successful, so different from the abandoning parents I'd imagined all my life. Marcus worked tirelessly to build our defense, but we faced significant challenges. Most of the people who might have known the truth about my early years were dead. Grandfather's contemporaries, the neighbors who might have witnessed what really happened, even his old attorney, had passed away years ago. We were left with fragments of documentation and my own memories of a man I'd loved and trusted completely. The most devastating blow came when Victoria Castellane produced a letter allegedly written by my grandfather to the Ashworths shortly after I came to live with him. In it, he promised to care for me temporarily while they got back on their feet, assuring them they could reclaim me whenever they were ready. The handwriting looked authentic, the letterhead was correct, and the tone sounded like grandfather's formal, careful way of writing. If this is real, Marcus told me during one of our late-night strategy sessions, it significantly strengthens their case. It suggests your grandfather understood this was a temporary arrangement. I stared at the letter, trying to reconcile it with everything I knew about my life. But why didn't they come back? If this is real, if they really wanted me, why did they wait 26 years? They claim they tried to contact him multiple times over the years and were rebuffed. They say he threatened legal action if they persisted, that he convinced them I was better off without them. The Ashworths themselves were harder to read than I expected. When I finally saw them during the first court appearance, they didn't look like monsters. Cordova was a well-dressed woman in her early 50s with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to my own. Damien was tall and distinguished, with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of years of professional success. Most unsettling was how they looked at me. Not with greed or calculation, but with something that might have been genuine pain. Cordova's eyes filled with tears when she saw me, and she whispered something to her husband that made him reach for her hand. For a moment, they looked like parents seeing their lost child for the first time in decades. During the depositions, I learned more about their version of events. They'd been 19 and 21 when I was born, both college students struggling financially. Cordova had postpartum depression. Damien was working 2 jobs to pay for his education, and they were living in a studio apartment barely large enough for 2 people, let alone a baby. My father-in-law offered to help, Cordova testified, her voice breaking. He said he had room, resources, experience with children. He made it sound temporary, just until we could get established. We were so young, so overwhelmed. We thought we were doing what was best for Serafina. And when did you realize this arrangement had become permanent? Victoria Castellane asked. When we tried to bring her home for Christmas that first year, Damien answered. Matthias said she was too young for the travel, that it would disrupt her routine. Then it was too cold. Then we were too busy with school. Then she was too settled. Every time we tried to reconnect, there was another reason why it wasn't the right time. Did you attempt to assert your parental rights legally? Cordova nodded, tears streaming down her face. We consulted an attorney when Serafina was 3, but Matthias had already filed for legal guardianship, claiming we'd abandoned her. Our attorney said fighting it would be expensive and difficult, especially since Serafina seemed happy and well cared for. We were still students, still struggling. We couldn't afford a protracted legal battle. The testimony was compelling, heartbreaking even. But something about it didn't ring true to me. The grandfather I knew had been scrupulously honest about everything else in his life. He'd told me difficult truths about death when my grandmother passed, about finances when the bookstore struggled, about my own limitations when I needed to hear them. Why would he lie about this one thing? The deeper we dug into the case, the more complex it became. Financial records showed that the Ashworths had indeed struggled early in their marriage, but they'd become quite successful within a few years of my birth. Property records showed they'd bought their first house when I was 5, a comfortable suburban home with plenty of room for a child. They had the means and opportunity to fight for you, Marcus pointed out, but there's no record of any legal action after that initial consultation until now. So why didn't they try harder? I asked. That's what we need to figure out. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While organizing grandfather's papers for the lawyers, I found a box I'd somehow missed during my initial sorting. Hidden in the back of his bedroom closet, it contained documents I'd never seen before: medical records, social services reports, and photographs that painted a very different picture of my early months. The medical records showed that I'd been hospitalized twice before coming to live with grandfather. Once for failure to thrive at 6 weeks old, and again for what appeared to be neglect-related malnutrition at 2 months. The social services reports were even more damning, documenting concerns about my care, missed pediatric appointments, and what one caseworker described as parents who appear overwhelmed and possibly unable to provide adequate care. The photographs were the most devastating evidence. They showed me as an infant, thin and clearly underdeveloped, with my grandfather holding me in what was obviously a hospital setting. On the back of one photo, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "Serafina, day 1 at home. Safe at last." "This changes everything," Marcus said when I brought him the box. "These documents suggest your grandfather didn't steal you. He rescued you. But even with this new evidence, we faced an uphill battle. The Ashworth's attorney argued that the medical issues were common in young, inexperienced parents, that they'd been seeking help and improving. She painted grandfather's actions as those of a controlling man who'd taken advantage of a struggling young couple. Mr. Thornfield may have had good intentions, Victoria Castellane argued, but he had no right to permanently separate parents from their child without proper legal proceedings. These young people were learning, growing, trying to do better. Instead of supporting them as a family, he removed their child and cut off contact. The most painful part of the proceedings was learning about the twins. Cordova and Damien had apparently become devoted parents to their other children, involved in school activities, supportive of their interests, present for every milestone. Victoria Castellane made sure the court saw dozens of family photos showing laughing, healthy children and engaged parents. My clients learned from their early mistakes, she argued. They became the parents they always had the potential to be. They should have been given that chance with Serafina as well. As the trial date approached, I found myself increasingly isolated. Old friends in town seemed uncomfortable around me, unsure whether to treat me as a victim or a beneficiary of some elaborate deception. The media attention was limited but intense, with local news portraying the case as a David and Goliath story of loving parents fighting a wealthy old man's estate. The hardest part was the growing uncertainty about my own memories and perceptions. Had grandfather been protecting me from something real? Or had he simply been an old man who'd fallen in love with a baby and couldn't bear to give her back? The evidence supported both interpretations, depending on how you looked at it. Marcus worked tirelessly to prepare our case, but as the weeks passed, his optimism faded. The truth is, Serafina, inheritance law tends to favor blood relatives, especially when there are questions about the circumstances of how guardianship was obtained. Even with the medical records, we're asking a judge to essentially validate what might have been an illegal appropriation of their child. But the will is clear, I protested. Grandfather left everything to me deliberately. He was of sound mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, but if the court finds that his guardianship was improperly obtained, it could invalidate his legal standing to make decisions about your inheritance. The Ashworths aren't just claiming the money, they're claiming they should have had parental input into your upbringing and major life decisions all along. The night before the trial, I sat in grandfather's study, surrounded by his books and memories, trying to prepare myself for what might be the end of the only life I'd ever known. The house would likely have to be sold to pay the inheritance, the bookstore would be closed, and everything that had made me who I was would be distributed among people who'd never been part of it. I thought about grandfather's final weeks, how he'd made sure all his affairs were in order, how he'd spoken to me about carrying on his values and his love of learning. He'd never seemed like a man burdened by guilt or secrets. He'd talked openly about his hope that I would find love, have children of my own, continue the family traditions that had sustained him. Remember, Serafina, he'd said during one of our last conversations, true family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you every day, who shape you into who you become. Don't let anyone convince you that biology alone creates unbreakable bonds. At the time, I thought he was talking about his hope that I'd marry and have children. Now I wondered if he'd been trying to prepare me for this moment, this challenge to everything we'd built together. The morning of the trial dawned gray and cold, with early November snow threatening in the heavy clouds. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that grandfather had bought me for my college graduation, trying to project the kind of dignified competence that would honor his memory and convince a judge that I was worthy of his faith in me. Marcus met me at the courthouse steps, his expression grim but determined. Remember, this isn't just about money, he told me as we climbed the stone steps. This is about honoring your grandfather's wishes and the life he wanted for you. Whatever happens in there, you've lived a life full of love and learning. No one can take that away from you. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and high windows that let in pale morning light. The Ashworths were already seated with their attorney, and I was struck again by how normal they looked, how little they resembled the abandoning parents I'd imagined all my life. Cordova turned when we entered, and our eyes met across the courtroom. For a moment, I saw something in her expression that might have been regret or longing or simply the weight of 26 years of complicated choices. She was older than I'd expected, with fine lines around her eyes and silver threading through hair that had once been the same rich brown as mine. The bailiff called the court to order, and I stood with everyone else as Judge Lysander Blackthorne entered the room. He was a tall man, in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that immediately focused attention. As he settled into his chair and began reviewing the case documents, I tried to read his expression for any hint of how he might rule. Marcus had researched Judge Blackthorne extensively. He was known for his fairness, his attention to detail, and his particular expertise in family law and estate disputes. He'd written several important opinions on parental rights and had a reputation for carefully weighing both legal precedent and human considerations in his rulings. This is a complex case involving competing claims to the estate of Matthias Thornfield, Judge Blackthorne began, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. We have before us questions of parental rights, guardianship validity, and testamentary intent that require careful consideration of both law and equity. He outlined the basic facts of the case, then called for opening statements. Victoria Castellane rose first, her presentation polished and emotionally compelling. She painted a picture of young parents who'd made a difficult decision in their child's best interest, only to have that temporary arrangement become permanent through the machinations of a man who'd fallen in love with their baby. Your Honor, my clients have spent 26 years wondering about their daughter, hoping she was happy and healthy, respecting what they believed was their father-in-law's temporary guardianship. They trusted family, and that trust was betrayed. Now, they're asking this court to recognize their legal rights as parents and to restore to them what should never have been taken away. Marcus's opening was more restrained but equally powerful. He focused on the medical evidence, on grandfather's documented concerns about my welfare, and on the clear intent of the will that had provided for my future. He painted grandfather not as a manipulator, but as a protector who'd stepped in when others couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate care. Your Honor, Matthias Thornfield loved his granddaughter enough to sacrifice his quiet retirement to raise her. The evidence will show that this wasn't a case of kidnapping or manipulation, but of a responsible adult taking action to protect a vulnerable child. His will reflects a lifetime of investment in her education, her future, and her well-being. The first witnesses were character witnesses for the Ashworths, colleagues and friends who testified to their success as parents to their twins, their stable marriage, their standing in the community. It was effective testimony that painted them as people who'd overcome their early struggles to become model citizens and devoted parents. Then came the more difficult testimony about those early months of my life. A retired social worker named Eleanor Hastings testified about her visits to the Ashworths' apartment when I was an infant. Her notes, preserved in the case file, painted a concerning picture of overwhelmed young parents struggling to meet a baby's basic needs. They weren't malicious, she testified, but they were clearly in over their heads. The apartment was chaotic, the baby was underweight, and both parents seemed exhausted and somewhat detached. I recommended parenting classes and increased support services. "And were those recommendations followed?" Marcus asked. "To some degree, but inconsistently. There were missed appointments, incomplete follow-through on the parenting education. Then, suddenly, the baby was no longer in their care." "Did they seek your assistance in regaining custody?" Eleanor Hastings shook her head. "No, they didn't. In fact, when I tried to follow up, they told me the situation had been resolved and asked me to close the case." This testimony clearly damaged the Ashworths' narrative that they'd been systematically denied access to me. If they'd really wanted me back, why hadn't they worked with social services to prove they'd addressed the original concerns? The medical testimony was even more damaging to their case. Dr. Patricia Whitmore, now retired but who'd been my pediatrician during those first months, testified about my condition when grandfather brought me to live with him. "The child was significantly underweight, showing signs of what we called failure to thrive," she explained. "There were missed vaccinations, irregular feeding patterns, and general indicators that suggested inadequate care. The improvement after she went to live with her grandfather was dramatic and immediate." "In your medical opinion, was the child in danger while in her parents' care?" Marcus asked. Dr. Whitmore hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of her answer. "I was concerned enough to recommend the social services involvement. The situation wasn't necessarily abusive, but it was certainly inadequate for the child's healthy development." Victoria Castellane cross-examined aggressively, pointing out that failure to thrive could have many causes, that the parents had been seeking help, that removing a child from struggling parents wasn't always the best solution. But the medical evidence was difficult to dismiss. The most emotionally charged testimony came when Cordova herself took the stand. She spoke about her postpartum depression, about feeling overwhelmed and inadequate as a mother, about gratefully accepting Matthias's offer of help. "I loved Serafina," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just didn't know how to take care of her. I was barely more than a child myself, dealing with hormones and depression and financial stress. When my father-in-law offered to help, it felt like a lifeline." "When did you realize that this help had become permanent?" Victoria Castellane asked. "Gradually," Cordova admitted. "At first, he said she needed to adjust to the new environment before visiting. Then it was that she was thriving and shouldn't be disrupted. When we tried to insist, he had a lawyer send us a letter saying that attempting to remove her could be considered harmful to her welfare." "How did that make you feel?" "Heartbroken, angry, but also scared. He had resources we didn't have, legal connections, financial stability. We were still students, still struggling. The lawyer we consulted told us that fighting him would be expensive and uncertain, especially since Serafina appeared to be thriving in his care." The testimony was compelling, and I found myself struggling with unexpected sympathy for this woman who claimed to be my mother. Whatever her failures as a young parent, her grief seemed genuine. But sympathy didn't change the legal realities or the fact that she'd chosen not to fight for me when it mattered most. Damien's testimony was similar, but more focused on the financial and legal pressures they'd faced. He spoke about feeling manipulated by Matthias's resources and connections, about being made to feel that pursuing their parental rights would somehow harm me. He had this way of making us feel selfish for wanting our daughter back. Damien testified. He'd talk about her progress, her happiness, her opportunities, and then suggest that disrupting her environment would be cruel. We were young and uncertain, and he was this distinguished professor with decades of experience. We let him convince us that stepping back was the loving thing to do. The picture that emerged was of a complex family situation where good intentions and poor communication had led to permanent separation. It wasn't the clear-cut case of abandonment I'd grown up believing, but it also wasn't the simple kidnapping the Ashworths claimed. As the testimony continued, I began to see the case differently. Perhaps grandfather hadn't lied to me, but he might not have told me the complete truth either. Perhaps he genuinely believed he was protecting me from inadequate parents, but had also fallen so in love with raising me that he'd been unwilling to give me back when they'd become more capable. The defining moment came when Marcus presented grandfather's own documentation of those early months. In addition to the medical records and photographs, he'd kept a detailed diary of my care, progress, and the interactions with my biological parents. The entries painted a picture of a man genuinely concerned about my welfare, but also increasingly attached to me. Early entries focused on my medical needs and development milestones. Later ones showed his growing emotional investment and his increasing skepticism about the Ashworths' ability to provide what he considered adequate care. One entry, dated when I was 8 months old, was particularly revealing. Cordova called again, asking about Christmas visit. Serafina is thriving here, gaining weight, meeting all developmental markers. The thought of disrupting her routine, even temporarily, fills me with anxiety. She feels like my daughter now. The child Margaret and I never had. I know this is selfish, but I truly believe she's better off with me. Another entry from when I was 2 years old showed his internal struggle with the situation. Received letter from their attorney again. They want to arrange regular visitation, work toward reunification. Serafina doesn't remember them at all now. Would it be cruel to introduce confusion into her life? She calls me Papa. This is the only home she's known, but am I holding on to her for her benefit or mine? The diary entries were devastating to our case in some ways, showing that grandfather had made increasingly unilateral decisions about my life without input from my biological parents, but they also showed his genuine love for me and his sincere belief that he was acting in my best interest. The final piece of evidence Marcus presented was a letter grandfather had written to me, to be opened only if questions about my custody ever arose. In it, he acknowledged the complexity of the situation and his own conflicted feelings. "My dearest Serafina," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then others have challenged the choices I made about your upbringing. I want you to know that every decision I made was guided by love for you and concern for your welfare. Your biological parents were not evil people, but they were young and overwhelmed, and you were suffering in their care. I stepped in because I couldn't bear to watch you fail to thrive, but I stayed involved because you became the daughter of my heart. I have tried to be the father you deserved, the grandfather who could give you the stable, loving home you needed. If that was wrong, it was wrong out of love, not malice." As Marcus finished presenting our case, I felt the weight of 26 years of complicated family history settling around us. There were no clear villains in this story, no obvious right answers, just people making difficult choices based on incomplete information and complicated emotions. Victoria Castellane's closing argument was powerful, focusing on parental rights and the importance of family preservation. She argued that while Matthias might have had good intentions, he'd had no right to permanently separate parents from their child without proper legal proceedings. Your Honor, this case is about more than money. It's about recognizing that biological parents have fundamental rights that cannot be superseded by well-meaning relatives, no matter how wealthy or well-connected they might be. My clients were denied the opportunity to grow as parents, to learn from their mistakes, to build a relationship with their daughter. That denial has had consequences that extend far beyond financial considerations. Marcus's closing was equally compelling, focusing on my welfare and grandfather's documented concerns about my care. He argued that the inheritance was the result of a lifetime of love and investment, that overturning it would invalidate not just grandfather's final wishes, but the legitimacy of the relationship that had defined my entire life. Your Honor, Serafina Thornfield is not a prize to be awarded to the highest bidder or the most sympathetic party. She is a young woman who was raised with love, care, and devotion by a man who stepped in when others couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate care. The inheritance she received reflects not just financial value, but the recognition of a relationship that was real, meaningful, and transformative for both of them. As the arguments concluded and Judge Blackthorne announced he would recess to consider his decision, I felt a strange mixture of dread and resignation. Whatever he decided would fundamentally change my understanding of my own life and identity. If he ruled in favor of the Ashworths, I would not only lose my inheritance, but also have to accept that the foundational relationship of my life had been based on legal and moral ambiguity. During the recess, the Ashworths approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. It was the first time we'd spoken directly, and I was surprised by how normal the interaction felt, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Serafina," Cordova said softly, "I want you to know that this isn't about the money for us. It's about recognition, about acknowledging that we should have been part of your life." I looked at this woman who shared my features, who might have shaped my childhood if circumstances had been different. But you chose not to fight for me when it would have mattered, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You let legal and financial considerations convince you to walk away. Damien stepped forward, his expression pained. We were told that fighting would hurt you, that stability was more important than our rights as parents. We believed we were being selfless. And now, I asked, is this about being selfless too? Cordova's eyes filled with tears again. Now, we're older, more secure, better able to handle whatever comes. We've learned that sometimes being selfless means fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult. The conversation was interrupted by the bailiff calling us back to court for Judge Blackthorne's decision. As we filed back into the courtroom, I tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. The judge had deliberated for over 2 hours, which Marcus said could indicate either careful consideration of a complex case or uncertainty about the right decision. Judge Blackthorne looked grim as he reviewed his notes one final time. The courtroom was completely silent, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I found myself holding my breath as he finally looked up and prepared to speak. This case has required me to balance competing legal principles and human considerations, he began, his voice measured and serious. We have questions of parental rights, child welfare, testamentary intent, and the complex dynamics of family relationships that don't fit neatly into legal categories. He paused, and in that moment of silence, I felt my entire future hanging in the balance. Everything grandfather had worked for, everything he'd hoped for my future, rested on the next words this man would speak. Before I announced my decision, Judge Blackthorne continued, I need to address something that has been bothering me throughout these proceedings. He looked directly at me, and his expression changed in a way I couldn't quite interpret. Something shifted in his eyes, a recognition or realization that sent an unexpected chill down my spine. Miss Thornfield, Judge Blackthorne said slowly, would you please state your full legal name for the record? The request seemed odd, given that we'd been using my name throughout the proceedings, but I complied. Seraphina Cordelia Thornfield, Your Honor. The judge's face went completely white. He set down his pen with a trembling hand and leaned back in his chair, staring at me with an expression of utter shock. The courtroom fell into confused silence as everyone tried to understand what was happening. Your middle name, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Where did that come from? Marcus stood up, clearly as confused as everyone else. Your Honor, is there a problem with the proceedings? Judge Blackthorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued staring at me with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion I couldn't understand. Bailiff, please clear the courtroom. I need to speak with counsel in chambers immediately. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat alone in the hallway, outside the judge's chambers, while Marcus, Victoria Castellane, and the Ashworths disappeared behind closed doors with Judge Blackthorne. Through the heavy wooden door, I could hear raised voices, though I couldn't make out specific words. When they finally emerged, everyone looked shaken. Marcus appeared stunned. Victoria Castellane seemed confused and angry, and the Ashworths looked like they'd seen a ghost. Judge Blackthorne was the last to exit his chambers, and when he saw me sitting on the bench, he stopped dead in his tracks. Miss Thornfield, he said, his voice still unsteady, I need to ask you some questions about your grandfather. Did he ever mention knowing a Judge Lysander Blackthorne in his younger years? I shook my head, completely bewildered. No, Your Honor. I'd never heard your name before this case. Did he ever speak about his time in Chicago before he moved to Vermont? This question hit me differently. Grandfather had indeed lived in Chicago before I was born, but he'd always been vague about that period of his life. He mentioned it occasionally, but he didn't like talking about those years. He said they were difficult, that he was glad to have made a fresh start in Vermont. Judge Blackthorne nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Miss Thornfield, I'm going to have to recuse myself from this case. There will be a delay while a new judge is assigned. Your Honor, Victoria Castellane interjected, my clients have a right to know why these proceedings are being disrupted. What possible conflict of interest could you have with this case? Judge Blackthorne looked at her, then at me, then at the Ashworths. His professional composure was completely gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable that seemed entirely out of place in the formal courthouse setting. The conflict, he said slowly, is that I believe Seraphina Thornfield is my granddaughter. The words hit the hallway like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, and Marcus immediately moved to steady me. The Ashworths both started talking at once, their voices rising in confusion and protest, while Victoria Castellane demanded explanations that Judge Blackthorne seemed unable to provide. That's impossible, Cordova said, her voice shrill with panic. Her grandfather was Matthias Thornfield. We know who her family is. Judge Blackthorne shook his head. Matthias Thornfield was my son-in-law. He was married to my daughter, Cordelia, who died in a car accident 27 years ago. The hallway began to spin around me. My middle name, Cordelia, the name that had triggered the judge's recognition. It wasn't a coincidence or a family tradition I'd never understood. It was my mother's name. But that's impossible, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Grandfather told me my parents abandoned me. He said my mother couldn't handle being a parent. Your mother died 6 months before you were born, Judge Blackthorne said gently. She was coming home from a doctor's appointment about the pregnancy when another driver ran a red light. The impact killed her instantly, but the paramedics were able to save you through emergency delivery. You spent your first 2 months in the hospital before Matthias was able to take you home. The revelation shattered everything I thought I knew about my life, my identity, my family history. My mother hadn't abandoned me. She died trying to bring me into the world. And this distinguished judge, who'd been deciding my fate, was actually my grandfather. Then who are they? I asked, gesturing toward the Ashworths, who were standing frozen in shock. I have no idea, Judge Blackthorne admitted, but they're certainly not your biological parents. Victoria Castellane was frantically shuffling through papers, her professional composure cracking as she tried to understand how her entire case had just collapsed. This is impossible. We have documentation, birth certificates, medical records. Then someone has been lying, Marcus said grimly. The question is who and why. The next few hours were a blur of revelations, document examinations, and phone calls to various agencies. In Judge Blackthorne's chambers, surrounded by law books and legal documents, the true story of my early life slowly emerged. My mother, Cordelia Blackthorne Thornfield, had been 28 when she died. Not 19 as the Ashworths claimed. She'd been married to Matthias for 3 years, and they'd been trying to have children for most of that time. When she finally became pregnant, both she and Matthias had been overjoyed. Judge Blackthorne, my real grandfather, showed me photographs from his wallet that he'd carried for 26 years. Pictures of my mother as a young woman, laughing and beautiful, with my eyes and my smile, pictures of her and Matthias together, clearly, deeply in love. Nothing like the struggling young couple the Ashworths had described. After Cordelia died, Matthias was devastated. Judge Blackthorne explained, his voice thick with old grief. You were so premature, so fragile, that the doctors weren't sure you'd survive. Matthias spent every day at the hospital, and when you were finally strong enough to come home, he threw himself into caring for you. It was the only thing that kept him going. But why didn't I know about you? I asked. Why did he never mention that you existed? Judge Blackthorne's expression grew complicated. Because we had a falling out after Cordelia's funeral. I was angry, grief-stricken, looking for someone to blame. I accused him of not protecting her, of letting her drive alone to appointments, of not being the husband she deserved. It was unfair and cruel, but I was destroyed by losing my only child. The guilt in his voice was palpable. Matthias tried to maintain contact, sent pictures and updates about you for the first few years, but I was too proud, too angry, too lost in my grief to respond. Eventually, he stopped trying. When I finally came to my senses and tried to reconnect, he'd moved to Vermont and left no forwarding address. He moved to protect me, I realized. He wanted to start fresh, somewhere you couldn't find us. I spent years trying to locate you both. Judge Blackthorne continued. I hired investigators, checked school records, even had connections in law enforcement keep an eye out. But Matthias was thorough. He'd created a new life for both of you where my anger and bitterness couldn't reach. The pieces were falling into place, but we still didn't understand how the Ashworths fit into the picture. Victoria Castellane was making frantic phone calls to her office, trying to verify the documentation her clients had provided, while Cordova and Damien sat in stunned silence. The truth about the Ashworths emerged gradually through phone calls and database searches. They weren't completely lying about having a daughter named Serafina. They had indeed given birth to a baby girl 26 years ago, but that child had died of complications just 3 days after birth. It appears, the investigator Marcus had called explained over speakerphone, that Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth have been living with the delusion that their deceased daughter is still alive. Hospital records show the death certificate was filed properly, but somehow they convinced themselves that the baby had been taken rather than died. The psychological evaluation that followed painted a tragic picture of two people who'd never properly grieved their child's death. Cordova's postpartum depression had been complicated by the loss, and instead of accepting the reality of their daughter's death, she'd created an elaborate fantasy that the baby had been stolen by family members. Over the years, they've collected documents, created false memories, even convinced some friends and family members that their version of events was true, the psychologist explained. When they learned about your inheritance case through media coverage, they saw an opportunity to claim the daughter they'd convinced themselves was out there somewhere. The forgeries in their documentation were sophisticated, but not perfect. When examined by experts, the birth certificate showed signs of alteration. The medical records contained inconsistencies, and the witness statements included several people who'd later admitted to being paid for their testimony. They're not criminals in the traditional sense, the psychologist continued. They genuinely believe their own story. The grief and guilt over losing a child can manifest in very complex ways, including elaborate denial mechanisms that can persist for decades. Victoria Castellane withdrew from the case that afternoon, her reputation and career likely damaged by having been unknowingly complicit in what amounted to an elaborate fraud. The Ashworths were taken for psychiatric evaluation, still insisting that I was their missing daughter, still unable to accept that their child had died over 2 decades ago. As the courthouse emptied and the legal machinery ground to a halt, I found myself alone with Judge Blackthorne in his chambers. This man who'd been about to decide my fate was actually my grandfather, the father of the mother I'd never known existed. I have so many questions, I said, sitting across from him at his massive desk, about my mother, about what she was like, about why grandfather never told me the truth. Judge Blackthorne reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick photo album I hadn't noticed before. I've been carrying this with me since I started looking for you, he said. Pictures of Cordelia growing up, her wedding to Matthias, the months when she was pregnant with you. We spent the next 2 hours going through the album, and I learned about the mother I'd never known. Cordelia had been brilliant, passionate about literature like her husband, devoted to social justice causes. She'd taught high school English while Matthias worked at the university, and they'd planned to alternate childcare responsibilities so both could continue their careers. She would have loved you so much, Judge Blackthorne said, pointing to a picture of my mother reading to a group of students. She always said that children were the future, that every child deserved to be seen and valued for who they were, not who adults wanted them to be. Why did grandfather lie to me about this? I asked. Why create a story about abandoning parents instead of telling me about my mother's death? Judge Blackthorn sighed deeply. I think he was trying to protect you from the grief that had nearly destroyed both of us. He saw what losing Cordelia did to me, how it made me bitter and angry and cruel. Maybe he thought it would be easier for you to believe your parents had chosen to leave than to know your mother had died bringing you into the world. But the abandonment story made me feel unwanted, unloved. At least knowing about my mother's death would have made me understand that I was wanted. Matthias wasn't perfect, Judge Blackthorn admitted. He was doing his best in an impossible situation, raising a child while dealing with his own grief, cut off from the only family he had left. He made choices that seemed right at the time, even if they weren't perfect in hindsight. As evening fell and the courthouse grew quiet around us, we began discussing what would happen next. The inheritance case was clearly resolved in my favor, since the people challenging it had no legal standing whatsoever. But beyond the legal questions, we faced the more complex issue of rebuilding a family relationship that had been severed by grief and pride. I'd like to get to know you, I told Judge Blackthorn. If you want that too, I've lost one grandfather, but maybe I don't have to face the future completely alone. His eyes filled with tears. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw genuine joy in someone's expression. I've been hoping for that chance for 26 years, he said. I have so much to make up for, so many years of your life that I missed because of my own stubbornness and pride. We both missed those years, I pointed out, but we can't get them back. We can only decide what to do with the years we have left. 2 months later, I was sitting in the kitchen of the house grandfather had left me, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a family gathering I never could have imagined. Judge Blackthorn, who insisted I call him Grandpa Lysander, was helping me prepare the stuffing recipe that had been my mother's favorite. She added sage and cranberries, he told me, carefully measuring spices the way my mother had taught him decades ago, said it made the stuffing taste like autumn should taste. The dining room table was set for 4. Marcus Pemberton had become more than just my attorney. In the aftermath of the case, he'd become a close friend and confidant. He was bringing dessert and what he called his famous wine selection, though he'd warned me his taste ran more toward scholarly than sophisticated. The 4th place setting was for Elena Carruthers, the woman Judge Blackthorn had been quietly dating for the past 3 years. He'd been nervous about introducing us, worried that I might resent him moving on from the grief that had defined so much of his life. Instead, I'd been delighted to meet the retired librarian who'd brought laughter back into his life and who shared my passion for first edition books. The months since the trial had been a period of discovery and healing for both of us. I'd learned about my mother's love of poetry, her terrible singing voice, her habit of leaving bookmarks in every book in the house. Judge Blackthorn had learned about my work, continuing grandfather's rare book business, my plans to expand into literary event hosting, my own complicated feelings about family and belonging. We'd also dealt with the aftermath of the Ashworth situation. They'd been hospitalized for several weeks while psychiatrists helped them work through the delusion that had controlled their lives for so long. When they were finally able to accept that their daughter had died, their grief was profound and heartbreaking. Judge Blackthorne had used his connections to ensure they received the best possible care. Driven by compassion for parents who'd lost a child, even if they weren't mine. Do you think Grandfather would approve? I asked, as we worked side by side in the kitchen. Of us reconnecting, of me keeping the house and the business? Judge Blackthorne paused in his stirring, considering the question seriously. I think Matthias loved you enough to want you to have family, even if it meant forgiving me for the years I wasted being angry and proud. He was a good man who made the best decisions he could with the information and emotions he had at the time. I found something last week, I told him, pulling a letter from the kitchen drawer where I'd been keeping it. It was hidden in one of Grandfather's books, in the poetry section. I think he meant for me to find it eventually. The letter was addressed to Judge Blackthorne, written in Grandfather's careful handwriting, but never sent. It was dated just 2 months before his death, suggesting he'd been thinking about our family situation even as his health declined. Lysander, the letter read, I know you'll never forgive me for taking Serafina away after Cordelia died, and I understand your anger, but she's grown into a remarkable young woman who would make both you and your daughter proud. She has Cordelia's intelligence, her compassion, her love of learning. If something happens to me, I hope you'll find a way to be part of her life. She deserves to know about her mother, about the family that loved her before she was even born. I'm sorry for all the years we've lost. I hope it's not too late to give Serafina the grandfather she's never known she had. Judge Blackthorne read the letter twice, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he carefully folded it and handed it back to me. He was trying to build a bridge, he said softly, even when he was angry with me, even when he was protecting you from my bitterness. He was thinking about what would be best for you in the long run. The doorbell rang, announcing Marcus's arrival, and we put the finishing touches on dinner preparations. As we gathered around the table that had once been the center of Grandfather's quiet life, I felt the profound rightness of continuing his traditions while making them my own. I'd like to make a toast, I said, raising my glass as we settled into our chairs. To family that's chosen and family that's found, to second chances and new beginnings, and to the people who love us enough to make difficult decisions, even when those decisions aren't perfect. To Cordelia, Judge Blackthorne added, his voice thick with emotion, who would have loved this gathering and everyone at this table. To Matthias, Elena said gently, who raised a remarkable young woman and left behind a legacy of love and learning. And to the future, Marcus concluded, whatever it might bring. As we shared the meal Grandfather's recipes had helped create, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us all together. A legal case that should have been about money and inheritance had instead revealed hidden family connections and healed wounds that had festered for decades. The inheritance itself had become less important than the relationships it had helped restore. The house was still mine, the business was still thriving, and the financial security Grandfather had wanted for me remained intact. But more than that, I'd gained a family I'd never known existed, and stories about a mother whose love had shaped my life, even though I'd never known her. After dinner, as we sat in Grandfather's study surrounded by his books and memories, Judge Blackthorne shared more stories about my mother's childhood and young adulthood. I learned that she'd been stubborn and independent, passionate about social justice, terrible at cooking, but determined to learn anyway for Matthias's sake. She would have fought for her inheritance just like you did, Judge Blackthorne told me with a smile. She never backed down from what she knew was right, even when it would have been easier to compromise. Do you think the Ashworths will be all right? I asked, still troubled by their tragic delusion and the years they'd spent living a lie. Their doctors are hopeful, he replied. Accepting their daughter's death was devastating, but it's also allowed them to begin grieving properly for the first time in 26 years. They're getting the help they should have received decades ago. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, I walked Judge Blackthorne to his car. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the old Victorian house glowed warmly behind us, its windows bright with the life continuing inside. Thank you, I said simply, for being fair during the trial, even when it must have been impossible, for being willing to try again with family, for giving me back my mother's memory. He hugged me tightly. This grandfather I'd inherited through tragedy and found through grace. Thank you for being exactly the granddaughter Cordelia would have wanted you to be, he said, for carrying on the best parts of what she and Matthias built together. After everyone left, I sat alone in grandfather's chair, now my chair, in the study that had always been the heart of this house. The inheritance case was over, decided not by legal arguments, but by the revelation of truth that had been hidden for decades. I'd kept everything grandfather had intended for me, but more importantly, I'd gained understanding about the complex web of love, loss, and protection that had shaped my entire life. The Ashworth case would likely become a cautionary tale about grief unprocessed and the dangerous power of denial. But for me, it had become something else entirely, a bridge to the past I'd never known existed and the family connections I'd thought were lost forever. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. The first of the season, settling gently on the garden where grandfather had taught me to appreciate the changing seasons. Inside, surrounded by the books that had been his passion and the memories that were now mine to preserve, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. The inheritance had never really been about money or property. It had been about legacy, about the continuation of love and values across generations, about the family we choose and the family that chooses us. Judge Blackthorne was right. Grandfather had been building bridges even when it seemed like he was burning them, thinking always of what would be best for me in the long run. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought about the letter I would write to my mother tomorrow, the first of many I planned to compose to the woman who'd given her life so I could have mine. I would tell her about the grandfather who'd raised me with such devotion, about the other grandfather who'd found his way back to us through courage and grace, and about the life I was building on the foundation they'd all helped create. The house settled around me with the familiar sounds of home, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace with both my past and my future. The inheritance was secure, the family was healing, and the love that had sustained us all was finally free to flourish in the light of truth rather than hide in the shadows of well-intentioned lies. The story that had begun with legal documents and false claims had ended with reconnection and understanding. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads exactly where you need to be. Just as grandfather's letter had predicted, in losing the parents I'd thought I had, I'd found the mother I'd never known existed. and the grandfather whose love had been waiting for me all along,